Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our final segment of today's show, we look prematurely a little bit. Another mistake on my part in looking at the fixture list in both the Premier League and Cup competitions around Europe. Man City, Newcastle. Although, what makes this game interesting is the games these two teams will play in the weeks ahead before this particular Premier League matchup that will define how they view this one in terms of their own form and in terms of how they'll view themselves on the Premier League table in this one, because both of them sit firmly in the top six. Man City 5th, Newcastle 6th. Both of them are coming off losses in the Premier League. Newcastle 2-1, a last kind of minute goal in their last game against the Fulham. Cottagers really damaged their top six hopes and potentially their chances of overtaking City in the Premier League table after their embarrassing 5-1 defeat on the road against Arsenal. And so I feel like this fixture, even though it's 2 weeks away, will clearly be defined by the games played in the interim, because both of these teams have very important fixtures in cup competition specifically that they'll want to focus in on, as well as potentially this game coming up in the Premier League. Because this will be the first game these two teams play in the Premier League after 2 weeks of cup competitions, both domestically and internationally. So let's talk about this a little bit. Last time these teams met, obviously, September 28th, 2024, 1-1 draw. Anthony Gordon and Josko Gvardiol were the goal scorers in that one. This one is going to look a little bit different because, much like the last one, both of these teams were coming off disappointing results. I believe this was also a situation where Newcastle had lost to Fulham, and Man City, I believe, that was their last encounter with Arsenal, and I don't necessarily think it went as well as this one as well, if I can remember. But let's talk about how this game will be impacted by the situations both of these teams find themselves in cup competitions. Newcastle, let's talk about them first, have it a little bit easier, but Man City certainly have a mountain to climb in terms of how they're juggling the Premier League and Champions League. As Tony Vlog says, enters the chat. How are you, my friend? Welcome to the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. But let's talk about Newcastle's situation, because it is a little bit more manageable, because they'll have a whole week to prepare for this game, whereas City have a couple of fixtures that will trouble them in the weeks ahead. Newcastle, though, tomorrow afternoon, they'll be playing in the League Cup semi-final against Arsenal. They actually hold a 2-goal advantage in that one, and they will want to win that game yet again to cement their place in the League Cup final. Newcastle really want a trophy this season. Obviously, as we all know, this is a rebuild that started when the Saudi-backed PIF fund came in and bought them and really developed them into a team that, while they definitely have the money to make high-profile signings, really decided to make shrewd signings that help this team really cement their status as one of the Premier League's elite. And they made it to the Champions League last year, probably didn't do as well as they had hoped, and now find themselves in yet another top 6 chase and potential spot in Europe. But I do feel like winning the League Cup could also be an important thing for this Newcastle squad to build upon. Because while it's not the biggest trophy they can win, it's still a trophy in this Saudi era. And I think that this project will ultimately have something to prove that it's paying off. And then on Saturday, they go and face Birmingham in the FA Cup 4th round. So probably a lot of rotation in that squad, but ultimately enough where they won't be as worried headed into the City game, because they have a full week to prepare for that. A lot of players will be rested for that one. City, on the other hand, are a team in crisis right now. I never thought I would be saying that, but they are a team in crisis. Yes, they tried to address a lot of these issues and areas of need in the transfer window, but all the players they brought in are really young and potentially flash in the pan guys. Omar Marmoush, potentially a half-season wonder, really hasn't impressed in his first couple of games with the City. And Kusanov and Rais are two youngsters who are kind of just being thrown into the fire and really probably don't have enough experience domestically and internationally to go into a squad the caliber of City's. To top it all off, injury woes have hit them, specifically the season-ending one to Rodri a couple of months ago, really hampering the midfield depth there. They really don't have anyone in their midfield to really compensate for the loss of a guy like Rodri. And now they head into a couple weeks of hell, so to speak. A week from now, they have to play Real Madrid in the Champions League. They squeaked by in the Champions League, but if I were them, I would rather have been eliminated in that final game against Club Brugge, because I feel like if I'm Man City and I'm looking at where we are in the Premier League table and I'm looking at how we're faring in cup competition, specifically the Champions League, I have to say, well, I have to pack it in. If I'm Pep Guardiola, I can't possibly imagine what a playoff round tie in the knockout stage of the Champions League will do to the psyche of this team, as well as have it being bookended by this important Premier League game against a top 6 rival. For the life of me, I don't know how City are going to get to this week. They also have an FA Cup tie game coming up tomorrow against Leyton Orient. But the reason why City will go into this game a little bit worse for wear is because they also have to prepare after this game for a midweek Champions League tie in the second leg against that same Real Madrid team. And I do believe that one, if I remember correctly, will be on the road at the Santiago Bernabeu for Manchester City. And seeing as to how they were really exposed against Arsenal on the road in that game just a couple days ago, I feel like Man City are looking a little bit directionless. That whole Phil Foden surge at the start of the year is starting to become a mirage. Haaland's not getting the same service he used to. This midfield is a shambles. Not even Kevin De Bruyne, a player of his technical skill and ability, could help this squad any further. But ultimately, seeing as to how this City team really profile, I feel like a game against this Newcastle squad, when you're looking ahead to the Real Madrid game midweek in the second leg of the Champions League, could see you potentially trapped in a game that does not suit your form. But let's be clear here. Newcastle, in my opinion, really are a team that I feel want to get good at combining cup success with domestic success, but still are in the early stages of that process, because last year they couldn't perform well in the Champions League and injuries hit them on that front as well, resulting in a disappointing domestic season. This year, they went far in the League Cup, and fortunately for them, they won't have to worry about the League Cup for a while, even if they advance to the final or even if they are eliminated. But ultimately, if I'm Newcastle, I'm thankful that my cup fixtures come at a time where I can prepare for this fixture. Whereas City are in a situation where games are constantly being thrown at them because of their elite levels over the years. And I feel like there's no end in sight for the City squad. So, I'm not necessarily predicting that this game will go too poorly for City. But I could see a situation where this Newcastle team, coming in fresh, wanting to build on cup success potentially, coming off a high, potentially of reaching the League Cup final and advancing in the FA Cup, could dominate City a little bit. Because City, I feel like, really are forcing their hand here, in that because they're not performing well domestically, they might start looking to the Champions League to add more energy to their season. and hope and optimism to their season. And the fact that they were drawn against Real Madrid does not really bolster any hope in the City squad, but it gives them a chance to say, hey, we're not doing well domestically, and the Champions League might be our only chance to gain consistency and form. Yes, it's a hard tie, but if we come through it, then potentially we can make a deep run in this thing, and it could save our butts a little bit. Because right now, I'm not buying City stock, but I can buy into it if they start investing in the Champions League and start realizing that potentially they don't necessarily have to succeed as much in the Premier League. But Newcastle are a weird team, right? Because in terms of form, they were in pretty banging form. They had won, I believe, 5 in a row to start the year in the Premier League. But that was a bizarre loss to Fulham. And they have had a couple of bizarre losses where they look like they have been in form and ultimately come up short in certain situations. But I feel like this Newcastle team, unlike last year, feels a little bit deeper, even though it's the same faces making an impact on the field. My only worry about them is potentially in their back line, because that is a very old back line you're looking at if you're a Newcastle fan. You're looking at guys like Fabian Schär and Dan Bourne being asked to perform at a high level. You have young guys in this back line, but they are your wing backs. And ultimately, if I'm Newcastle, that has to be something I want to address in future transfer windows with the money we have. But I do feel like they don't care because their attacking prowess is so elite. They have guys like Isaac, Gordon, Bruno Guimarães' creativity in the midfield really is standing out for them as well. And so I really am starting to buy into what Newcastle is building here. Because even though a lot of people are probably thinking, well, why aren't they competing not just in domestic competitions but internationally? Why aren't they competing in the Champions League? Why aren't they competing for Premier League trophies? I appreciate what they're doing to really not necessarily buy into what City have had to stare down in a couple of months. They're being astute about this whole Saudi backing. They're not throwing cash at certain players, whereas City are now forced to reckon with it a little bit because with their form notwithstanding, they now have that 115 charge cloud hanging over their head because of their own financial situations in the past years. So this is a very interesting Premier League game, and yes, I'm looking at it a little bit prematurely, but I'm intrigued to see how both of these teams attack it. Because right now, I feel like Newcastle will probably be the more revitalized side heading into it, and Man City will be struggling on both fronts a little bit, considering the fact that while I feel like they need to invest in the Champions League, it's going to be hard to invest a lot of resources in beating Real Madrid yet again. But ultimately, it should be a good game. I am predicting that this will be a draw still, just because Newcastle are an iffy Premier League team, and I haven't been able to predict them in the Premier League as of late. So that's what I'm giving City as kind of pity for going up against Real Madrid midweek and having it bookended by this tie. But ultimately, it should be a good game. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below, because that will just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Deadball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always with the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30. Remember, all you have to do to support the show, like, follow, subscribe, super chat, super things, and super stickers features are the best way to interact with our show. But as always, I will see you tomorrow. I'm out for today.